Okay, so when it comes to outlining, a good outline saves time. So the more work you do now, the less work you have to do later in terms of preparing and research, in terms of preparing and organizing a paper. And so let's look at some advantages of outlines. Why it helps the process. It helps structure the paper. It makes sure to organize arguments and points of view. It makes sure to settle placement of sources and evidence so you can put them in a logical flow. You're able to do a visual representation of what your paper is looking like. And that ends up being really beneficial for you because then you can kind of edit while you're looking at it. And you don't have to write a lot first before uh, before you actually commit it to paper. You can actually look at it on your outline. You can move things around. You can change the logical flow of things, change the way that points of view or evidence or sources are placed. So it's really, really helpful. So let's look at a demo of this to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So if we were to look at, this is our basic structure for like an introductory paragraph for your final. So you would have a declaration of what the topic is, the question trying to be answered or observed, and then you would look at two perspectives and their contributing arguments. That's why you have side A argument 1, 2, 3, side B argument 1, 2, 3. And so you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, okay, that's all cool and all, but like, how does that look in practice? Well, let me go ahead and show you. So let's look at the question of, should the United States force tech companies implement encryption backdoors? Okay, interesting question. So let's look at the two positions that are being observed and what are the arguments for each. So encryption backdoors should be implemented. Well, the arguments there are, it aids terrorism investigations, empowers law enforcement, and acts as a deterrent. Or encryption backdoor should not be implemented because of security vulnerabilities, violates right to privacy, and international implications. Now, you notice I'm not adding any more detail because when it comes to your introduction, it should be relatively short. An introduction shouldn't be more than about 5 or 7 sentences, 5 or 7 pages. Could you imagine? It shouldn't be more than about 5 or 7 sentences. It's just an appetizer. It's giving you some basic information in order for the reader to be able to understand like what's the paper going over, what's the objective, and where's it going. And so that's why in an introduction you should just be relatively short and concise. So just so you know, there are those who think that encryption backdoor should be implemented because they argue it aids in terrorism investigations, empowers law enforcement, and acts as a deterrent. There are those who argue that encryption backdoor should not be implemented because it opens up security vulnerabilities, it violates the right to privacy, and causes international implications towards human rights activists and political dissidents. And that's it. You're just doing 2 sentences that kind of list off what the main arguments are that you're going to be going over on each side. And then you'll go, the purpose of this analysis is to analyze the debate over whether or not should the United States force tech companies to implement encryption backdoors. So it's a relatively simple structure, but I try to implore everybody to not overthink it. You shouldn't be having an introductory paragraph that's a page and a half long. I think there's this compulsion with undergrads to want to feel like they need to explain themselves fully in an introduction because that's, in order to make more sense. But the thing is, you have the whole paper to explain yourself. And so feel free to just make this a very short introduction that just quickly goes over, what the topic is, what's the question being asked, what are the perspective looks at, and what's the purpose of the paper. If you're able to do that, then you can move on very quickly. By the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time so I can answer questions or anything that you want me to clarify. So
When you say short, like how short?
5
Like
to
I don't
7
want to make it
sentences.
like 7 sentences.
Like 5 to 7 sentences, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So let's look at some definitions. So definitions, your definitions paragraph doesn't have to be sexy. It doesn't have to flow really well. This is a very utilitarian and functional paragraph. What this does is it defines the terms, the rules of the road, the language that we're using. And so, you know, term one definition, include a citation for you got it. By the way, the dictionary doesn't count. We'll get to that in a while. And then I just did 3 terms. It could be, you know, there could be 2 terms, there could be 10 terms. Just for the sake of fitting something on a slide, I did 3. So you might be wondering how this looks like in practice. So if we look at definitions, things like encryption, the process of converting information or data into a code, particularly to prevent unauthorized access. Mansfield 2017, page 700. We're noticing we have the page number, so that must be a journal article citation. So the operating system, software that supports a computer's basic functions such as scheduling tasks, executing applications, controlling peripherals. Montez 2019. And then we have encryption backdoor, the actual, you know, the belle of the ball, the man of the hour. An encryption backdoor is a deliberate weakness in encryption intended to let governments have easy access to encrypted data. Galore 2017, page 202. So, interesting question for you guys. Why did I say encryption first? Why is encryption backdoor the last thing I put, but I put encryption and operating system first?
Because if you don't know what encryption is, you won't know what encryption backdoor is.
Precisely. Very good. And so you want to make sure that when I'm talking about like logical flow of ideas and terms and definitions, this is what I'm talking about. And so I picked this in particular because it makes sense like this. You know, for instance, if you're doing universal background checks for gun sales, right? Before you start talking about universal background checks, what should you probably mention and define first?
What a regular background check even is.
Yeah, exactly. What is a background check? You know, how does that work? Who administers it? You know, how is it, you know, how is it processed? Exactly. So if you're going to talk, before you can talk about universal background checks, you have to define, well, what's a background check? So once we do our definitions, then we go into the history of it. And this is, you know, chronological timeline showing us how did we get here? You know, so I have like event 1, 2, and 3 with a date and description and a citation. You'll notice in the example I have, I don't include a description for the sake of space, but this will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about encryption backdoors, particularly the disputes between FBI and Apple, you'll notice that the San Bernardino shooting was a big deal in terms of this debate because this is what kind of set everything off. December 2nd, 2015. I know many of you are, you know, still very aware of what happened. But then we go to the FBI Apple encryption dispute after the San Bernardino shooting to gain access to the shooter's device. And that went on for months over the course of 2015 and 2016. And then that died down for a while. And then after the FBI was able to use a third-party dealer to open up the phone. But then the Naval Air Station shooting in Pensacola, Florida last year kind of reopened the debate again between the FBI and Apple and kind of the tech industry writ large. So that's where this is kind of bubbling up. So you notice that in the history, we're trying to set up, you know, what are the events that got us to this place? You might think like, if you're talking about like the gun debate, for instance, in for like, you know, gun control, universal background checks or something like that, you might want to talk about Lyndon B. Johnson's 1965 Gun Control Act, the Brady Bill in the late 80s after the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, and then probably like the assault weapons ban in the 90s under Clinton. And then once we've set up our once we've introduced the topic, we've defined the rules of the road, we've set up the history of how this debate got to where it is. Now we actually look at the arguments. So side A, argument one, evidence or quote, and then your citation, and then and so on and so forth. So let's look at this in practice. So encryption backdoors should be implemented. While this aids terrorism investigations, the FBI has argued that access to terrorism suspects' devices can prevent attacks. Hunt, 2018, page 144. Or how it empowers law enforcement or acts as a deterrent. You notice that we're going in and putting in citations and paraphrases from different articles and different places, making sure to give attribution to the author. And so that way you're able to take, you notice that the arguments that are being listed in A, B, and C are the same ones that we introduced in the introduction, in the order that we were introduced as well. So don't be willy-nilly on the order when you do it in the introduction. Make sure that you are respectively putting them in the order in which you want to address them in the paper. That way it's just more orderly, and it primes people to think that this is where you're going to go next. And then apropos, we're going to talk about the next, the other side of the argument, and then go ahead and explore that. For instance, encryption backdoor should not be implemented. So we have security vulnerabilities, for instance, as one of the major ones. And in this case, instead of having a paraphrase or a snippet from an article, we actually have a quote. In the wrong hands, this software, which does not exist today, would have the potential to unlock any iPhone in someone's physical possession. Tim Cook wrote this in 2016, his open letter that he posted to a number of newspapers. You notice, hence the no page number on the citation, implying that it's a newspaper citation. And then we have, like, for instance, violations of the rights of privacy and international implications. And then we have another quote here from Sanchez. If Apple develops software to help the US government bypass iPhone encryption, foreign governments are sure to take notice, and countries like China and Russia have a much more expansive idea of what constitutes a crime. So we have interesting evidence to back up what those international implications are. Now, naturally, in your paper, you would kind of discuss and dissect what those are. And naturally, you're not going to have just like one piece of evidence for every argument. You're going to have multiple pieces of evidence, but like I said, for the sake of space, this is what we're looking at. One of these outlines, for instance, if you're doing them, is probably about like 2 to 3 pages. But if you think about it, if every single one of these is just a small line of text, you'll probably be able to blow through that pretty quickly. So we've discussed we've defined our terms, we've discussed the historical context, we've looked at the arguments for both sides, and now we get to the evaluation and critique. And this is the real kind of line in the sand. Everything before this is fair game to bring in evidence and all of that, but once you get to your evaluation critique, all bets are off. You go ahead and draw a line in the sand, and no new evidence is now put in to the evaluation critique. You're just now discussing the implications of everything you've brought up. And this is like the real grad school level of doing this, because it's not just about how you feel something should happen. Nobody cares. Nobody cares how you feel about anything. People want to know what you think will happen, not what you feel should happen. I feel that we should all get $1 million. That's lovely. Let's talk about what I think will happen. I'll be signing up for an unemployment check probably. So we have to be able to, that delineation between feel what should happen and think what will happen separates undergraduate work from graduate work. Graduate work is about analytical thinking within the confines of looking at the evidence and making educated projections on what should happen given a certain set of circumstances. So if the status quo remains, if things remain the same, well, what are the conclusions that we can come to? What are those implications, and what are the implications of that? So if we're talking about if spanking should be, should be illegal, what happens if it doesn't, if it remains legal? What happens? What does that mean? Or what happens if policy changes occur? Then what are the implications of that? What happens if spanking is made illegal? Well, what can we conclude from that? What's the implications of that? What will happen? And so we need to be able to take those into account, that we look at the data, we look at what the trends are, and we make educated projections based off of the evidence. And so if we look at this, here's one. If encryption backdoors remain prohibited, well, the conclusions we can make is that encryption backdoors will remain at bay while foreign governments are unable to exploit American precedent. However, the implications of that will be there will be difficulties in law enforcement compelling tech companies to assist in opening devices. However, if we look at the other perspective, if any encryption backdoors are implemented, encryption backdoors open the door for a new tech precedent globally, and as a result, foreign governments may use the precedent to compel tech companies to unlock devices that could put human rights advocates and political dissidents in danger. You notice the wording in there. It could put human rights advocates, may use the precedent. We're couching these in language that is is in line with a prediction. Whereas there's a higher confidence yield because the whether or not encryption backdoors are implemented, that is a hypothetical. We haven't done it yet. Whereas if we look at encryption backdoors will remain prohibited, we know what happens because we've seen it. It's measurable, it's observable. That's why the implications are there will be difficulties in law enforcement compelling tech companies because we've been able to actually see it. So it can be, there's a higher confidence, what we would call a confidence interval on that. And so this is what I mean by, what are the conclusions and implications? What's going to happen? For instance, if you're doing a paper on DACA, for instance, okay, that's all well and good if DACA changes and is reinstated. But okay, that's not the end of it. Okay, it's reinstated. What does that mean? What are the implications of that? What happens because DACA is brought back? What do we do with that? So these are the kind of questions that we have to think about.